The flashing red and blue lights lit up the street, cutting through the evening haze. Snoop Dogg leaned back against his Ferrari, his arms crossed, his expression calm but sharp. The crowd around him murmured, their phones raised, capturing every second of what was unfolding. "Step away from the car," barked the officer, his voice cold and clipped. His hand hovered over the taser on his belt, a silent threat. Snoop's gaze didn't waver. "What's the problem, officer? I'm parked. Ain't breaking any laws here." The officer narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "I said step away now." The tension in the air was electric. People on the sidewalk stopped to watch, some whispering in disbelief. A few bold voices cut through the murmur. "That's Snoop Dogg, man. What's this cop doing? You recording this? They can't get away with it." The officer took a step closer, his shadow falling over Snoop. His voice dropped, icy and deliberate. "You think you're special because of that car? Because of your fame?" "Not out here, you're not." Snoop smirked faintly, his hand still resting casually on the hood of his car. "Special? Nah, I'm just a guy driving his ride. You got a reason for pulling me over, or are we just wasting time?" The officer's face flushed with irritation. "License and registration, now." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. He gestured toward the crowd, many of whom were now recording. "You all seeing this, right? Just making sure the world knows what's going on here." The officer's patience snapped. "I said now!" His voice cracked with anger, drawing gas from the growing crowd. Snoop straightened up, his height matching the officer's. "You can bark orders all you want, officer, but you still haven't told me why I'm being stopped." The cop's hand twitched toward his taser. The crowd erupted in murmurs, their anxiety palpable. "Hey, leave him alone, man!" a voice shouted from the back. "Don't touch him," someone else called. Snoop turned his head slightly, addressing the crowd without breaking his stare with the officer. "Y'all keep those cameras rolling, you hear me?" The officer's face twisted with frustration. He glanced at the phones pointed at him, then back at Snoop. "This isn't a game, Mr. Dogg. Step back from the car, or you're coming with me." A slow smile spread across Snoop's face. "Coming with you? For what?" "I'm standing here, calm as can be, answering your questions. So tell me, officer, what's the charge?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He stepped forward, invading Snoop's space, and jabbed a finger toward his chest. "Don't push me, boy." The single word hung in the air, sharp as a knife. The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs turning into angry shouts. "Did he just say that? Unbelievable!" Snoop's expression darkened, his calm exterior cracking just slightly. He tilted his head, locking eyes with the officer. "Boy, huh? That's how we're doing this?" Before the officer could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. More squad cars rolled onto the scene, their lights spinning wildly, casting an eerie glow over the gathering. Snoop stepped back, raising his hand slightly. "Looks like the cavalry's here," he said, his voice low but cutting. The officer turned his head toward the incoming cars, his frustration now mixed with uncertainty. The crowd shifted, their attention split between the new arrivals and the unfolding drama. The moment felt frozen, like the entire street was holding its breath. No one knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This was about to make headlines. The sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Snoop Dogg's luxurious mansion. The morning was quiet, calm, and perfect, just the way he liked it. A smooth jazz melody floated through the air, blending seamlessly with the faint rustle of trees outside. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee and bacon lingered, adding to the serene atmosphere. Snoop leaned back in his kitchen chair, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He wore a crisp white t-shirt and loose black joggers, the kind of outfit that said comfort without effort. His signature gold chain caught the morning light, gleaming against his chest with every small movement. Today felt like one of those rare, easygoing days where nothing could go wrong. He glanced at his phone on the marble countertop, notifications piling up like they always did. Memes, fan messages, tags. His social media was alive and buzzing, just like every other day. He smirked, setting his coffee down. "Man, they never stop showing love," he muttered, scrolling through the messages. But even as he appreciated the attention, He was in no rush to respond. Today wasn't about work, deadlines, or interviews. Today was his day off, and he was determined to keep it that way. The smell of eggs and bacon still lingered, reminding him of the hearty breakfast he'd just polished off. The empty plate sat next to him, the crumbs a quiet testament to a morning well spent. He stretched, his arms reaching above his head as his joints cracked in satisfaction. "All right," he said to himself, standing up. "Time to hit the streets." The hallway echoed softly with the rhythm of his footsteps as he headed toward the garage. The walls were lined with memorabilia, platinum records, awards, framed photos of him with legends in the music industry. Each item told a story of success, hard work, and perseverance. But there was one thing in the garage that stood out among all the trophies: a red Ferrari 488 Pista, polished to perfection. The Ferrari wasn't just a car, it was a statement. Its candy red body gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the room like a flawless mirror. Custom Snoop license plate added the final touch, a reminder of the legacy he'd built. "All right, baby girl," Snoop said softly, running his hand across the car's hood. "Let's go make some noise." Sliding into the leather driver's seat, he felt the familiar rush of energy that came with starting the engine. The deep growl echoed through the garage, reverberating in his chest. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes for a brief moment as the vibrations filled the air. "Let's ride." The garage door rolled up slowly, revealing the bright, golden sunlight of the day. As Snoop eased the car out, the sound of the tires rolling over the pavement was smooth as silk. Soon he was on the open road, the city skyline sharp and clear against the blue sky. With the music blasting, Snoop tapped the steering wheel to the rhythm of the beat. The Ferrari's engine purred like a lion, demanding attention from everyone it passed. People on the sidewalks turned their heads, some pulling out their phones to record as he cruised by. "That's Snoop Dogg!" someone shouted, waving excitedly. Snoop glanced their way and raised his hand in a casual peace sign. The attention wasn't new, but it always made him smile. Life was good, and he was grateful for every bit of it. He stopped at a red light, his fingers tapping the wheel as the music played. Moments like these reminded him why he worked so hard. No stress, no deadlines, just a man, his car, and the open road. But as the light turned green and he drove through the intersection, a flash of black and white in his rearview mirror caught his attention. A police cruiser sat at the corner, its presence impossible to ignore. Snoop glanced at it briefly, paying no mind. "Ain't nothing to worry about," he told himself. He wasn't speeding or swerving, just cruising. But as he made a left turn, the cruiser pulled out behind him. He frowned, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. The cruiser followed him closely, its presence now impossible to ignore. For a moment, he considered pulling into a nearby parking lot, but he decided against it. "Not today," he said, shaking his head. "Don't do it, man. Just don't." But the sharp whoop of the siren behind him made his stomach drop. The red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, their reflection dancing across the dashboard. "Damn," he muttered, his jaw tightening. He signaled to pull over, easing the Ferrari to the side of the road. Parking it neatly, he reached for his phone. He wasn't about to take any chances. If this went bad, the whole world was going to see it. As the cruiser came to a stop behind him, Snoop opened Instagram Live with a calm but serious expression. "Y'all, this is what it's like," he said, his voice steady as the screen filled with comments. "Red Ferrari, black man, and we all know how this ends. Stay tuned." Thousands of viewers flooded the stream within seconds. The comments poured in. "Not again. Stay safe, Snoop. We watching this live, bro." The door of the police cruiser swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out. His shaved head gleamed under the sun, and his mirrored sunglasses made it impossible to see his eyes. He walked slowly toward the Ferrari, his hand resting on his belt, fingers dangerously close to his taser. Snoop watched him through the side mirror, his expression calm but alert. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, setting his phone on the dashboard to capture everything. As the officer tapped on the window, Snoop rolled it down halfway. "Afternoon, officer," he said, his tone smooth but firm. "Everything all right?" The officer's face was stiff, his gaze cold. "License and registration," he said, his voice low and rough. Snoop tilted his head, studying the man for a moment before responding. For what? What's the reason for the stop? The officer didn't flinch. His expression hardened as he pointed a finger at Snoop. Step out of the vehicle, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Snoop's fingers flexed on the steering wheel as the officer's demand hung in the air. He could feel the tension building, the heat of the moment pressing down on him. Slowly, he glanced at his phone, the live stream comments rolling in faster than he could read. Step out of the vehicle, the officer repeated, his voice cold and unyielding. For what? Snoop asked, his tone calm but firm. He kept his gaze steady, unflinching. I wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving. So what's the reason for the stop? The officer leaned closer, tapping the window with two knuckles. Step out, now! Snoop sighed, shaking his head slightly as he glanced at the camera. Y'all seeing this, right? He said, addressing his audience. I asked a simple question, and now he's acting like I'm the problem. The officer's jaw tightened as he straightened up, clearly annoyed by the crowd forming on the sidewalk. Phones were already out, recording every second of the interaction. A few murmurs turned into audible whispers. That's Snoop Dogg! What's going on? This don't look right. Keep filming. Snoop opened the car door slowly, his movements deliberate. He stepped out and adjusted his shirt, standing tall as he faced the officer. All right, here I am, he said, spreading his arms slightly. Now you gonna tell me what this is about? The officer stepped back, his hands still hovering near his taser. Put your hands where I can see them. Snoop raised his hands, palms open. They're right here, officer. Clear as day. Now what's the issue? You match the description, the officer said, his voice clipped. Snoop tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. The description? Of what? A guy driving a nice car? The crowd murmured louder, a few voices cutting through the tension. Man, this is ridiculous. He's doing nothing wrong. The officer's face hardened. Turn around and face the car. For what? Snoop asked, his calm demeanor starting to crack. You still haven't told me why I'm being stopped. You think you can just do this because you feel like it? The officer stepped closer, his voice dropping. Turn around or I'll make you. The words hit like a warning shot, and the crowd reacted immediately. Hey, you can't talk to him like that. Leave him alone, man. Snoop shook his head, his hands still raised. Nah, I ain't resisting. I'm just asking a question. What law did I break? What's the charge? The officer's patience snapped. He grabbed Snoop's arm, spinning him around and pressing him against the Ferrari. Bright red paint reflected the harsh sunlight, and Snoop winced as the officer twisted his arm behind his back. You're resisting, the officer said through gritted teeth as he pulled out handcuffs. Resisting what? Snoop shot back, his voice louder now. I'm standing here, doing everything you say, and you're still pulling this? The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, cold and tight. The crowd erupted, their shouts growing louder. He didn't do nothing! This is why we don't trust y'all! Snoop turned his head slightly, his voice calm but cutting. Y'all keep recording this. Don't stop. The world needs to see. The officer yanked Snoop back toward the car, his grip firm. You think this is a game, he muttered, leaning closer. Out here, I'm in charge, not you. Snoop didn't flinch. You sure about that, officer? 'Cause it looks like the world's watching you now. The officer glanced at the phones pointed at him, his face flushing with irritation. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling as he tried to regain control of the situation. Suddenly, a voice from the crowd cut through the noise. Hey, what's your badge number? The officer froze for a moment before barking, Back up! All of you! But the crowd didn't move. If anything, they pressed closer, their phones capturing every second. We're not going anywhere, someone shouted. We see you! The officer turned back to Snoop, his expression a mix of anger and frustration. You want to play this game? Fine. He pressed Snoop harder against the car, his knee digging into his back. Snoop winced but kept his composure. You're making a big mistake, he said, his voice steady. And when this video goes live, the whole world's going to see it. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his radio, barking something about backup. The sirens in the distance grew louder, the flashing lights drawing closer. Snoop tilted his head, catching sight of the crowd in the reflection of his car window. Their faces were a mix of outrage and determination. "Y'all see this?" he said, addressing the camera on his phone. "This is what it's like. No matter how calm you are, they still treat you like this." The comments on his live stream poured in faster than ever. "This is insane. Stay strong, Snoop. We got your back, King." Within moments, more squad cars pulled up, their lights casting a chaotic glow over the scene. The crowd parted slightly as the new officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the situation. "All right, what's going on here?" one of them called out, his tone sharp. The first officer turned, his grip on Snoop loosening slightly. "Suspect was resisting," he said, his voice firm. "Had to detain him." The new officer frowned, his gaze shifting between Snoop, the crowd, and the live streaming phone. "Resisting?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "That what you're going with?" Snoop glanced over his shoulder, his expression calm but defiant. "You see the cameras, don't you? You see what really happened." The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The crowd waited, the officers exchanged glances, and Snoop stood firm, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This ain't just about me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is about all of us. And trust me, the truth's gonna come out." The tension on the street was electric. The flashing lights of the squad cars reflected off the sleek red surface of Snoop Dogg's Ferrari, turning the vehicle into a glowing centerpiece of the escalating drama. The crowd had grown larger, their voices growing louder with every passing second. The first officer tightened his grip on Snoop's arm, his frustration boiling over. "You want to make this harder than it needs to be? Fine. Stay right there." Snoop stood with his hands cuffed behind his back, his calm composure unwavering. "Harder?" he said, his voice steady and cutting. "You're the one making it harder, officer. I'm just standing here cooperating." The officer ignored him, his jaw tight as he glanced at the growing crowd. The murmurs and shouts from the bystanders only seemed to irritate him more. "Back up, all of you!" he barked, pointing at the crowd with one hand while gripping Snoop's arm with the other. "We're not going anywhere," someone shouted back. "We're watching you." "Leave him alone, man," another voice called out. The officer turned back to Snoop, his face a mix of anger and unease. "You think they're gonna save you?" he hissed, leaning closer. "Out here, I'm the law." Snoop tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Out here, the cameras are the law, and you're already losing." The officer's face flushed red with rage. He shoved Snoop against the Ferrari with more force, the loud thud of Snoop's body hitting the car echoing down the street. The crowd gasped in unison, their shouts turning into outright protests. "What's wrong with you?" someone yelled. "He's not resisting! Stop it!" Snoop winced but refused to show weakness. He turned his head slightly, addressing the live streaming phone that was still perched on the dashboard. "Y'all seeing this, right?" he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "This is how they do us. No reason, no charge, just because they can." The officer stepped back slightly, his hand twitching near his taser. He scanned the crowd, his frustration mounting with every passing second. The phones pointed at him felt like 1,000 eyes boring into his soul. "All right, enough," he snapped, his voice cracking with anger. "Everyone clear out, or I'll start making arrests." But the crowd didn't move. If anything, they grew bolder. "For what?" a woman shouted, stepping forward with her phone held high. "We're just standing here." "You can't arrest all of us," another voice added, drawing cheers from the onlookers. The officer's chest heaved with frustration. He turned back to Snoop, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny?" he said through gritted teeth. "You think this is a game?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "A game? Nah. But you're playing yourself right now, officer." The officer lunged forward, grabbing Snoop by the shoulder and yanking him toward the back of the car. His movements were rough, almost desperate, as if trying to assert control over a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "Get on the ground," the officer shouted, his voice echoing across the street. "For what?" Snoop shot back, his voice louder now. "What law did I break? What's the charge?" "I said, get on the ground!" The officer barked again, pushing Snoop down onto his knees. The crowd erupted in outrage, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of anger and disbelief. "This is insane!" someone yelled. "You're going too far!" another shouted. Snoop's knees hit the pavement. the rough concrete biting into his skin. He looked up at the officer, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said, his voice low but dangerous. "This just makes you look weak." The officer's face twisted into a snarl. "Shut up," he snapped, pressing his hand on Snoop's shoulder to force him lower. "You're not in charge here." The weight of the officer's hand pushed Snoop down further, his chest now pressed against the ground. The crowd's protests grew louder, their anger reaching a fever pitch. "Get off him," a man shouted, stepping closer to the scene. "He's already down. What's your problem?" "Badge number 2276, another voice called out. "We got it. You're done, man." The officer glanced at the crowd, his face betraying a flicker of fear. He looked back at Snoop, who was still lying on the ground, his breathing steady despite the pressure on his back. "You're making a big mistake," Snoop said, his voice calm but cutting. "The world's watching, and they're not going to forget this." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he pressed his knee into Snoop's back, eliciting another round of gasps and shouts from the crowd. "Yo, what the hell?" someone yelled. "He's not even resisting." "This is messed up," another voice added. Snoop clenched his teeth, the pain radiating through his body, but he refused to give the officer the satisfaction of seeing him break. "You feel powerful now?" he muttered, his voice strained but defiant. "Enjoy it while it lasts." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the noise, the flashing lights of more squad cars illuminating the scene. The crowd turned their attention to the new arrivals, their murmurs turning into hopeful whispers. "Maybe they'll stop this? They better do something." The first officer glanced toward the new cars, his expression shifting from anger to unease. He stepped back slightly, his knee still pressing into Snoop's back as the new officers approached. "What's going on here?" one of the new officers called out, his tone sharp and authoritative. The first officer straightened up, his hand finally moving away from Snoop. "Suspect was resisting," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "Had to detain him." The new officer frowned, his eyes scanning the scene. He looked at Snoop, still lying on the ground, then at the crowd, their phones capturing every detail. "Resisting?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "That what you're sticking with?" The crowd erupted again, their voices a mix of outrage and vindication. "He didn't resist. We saw everything. Check the cameras." The first officer's face flushed as he glanced at the phones, his confidence faltering. The new officer stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "If he was resisting, why's half the neighborhood recording otherwise?" The first officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked at Snoop, then back at the crowd, his frustration evident. "You're done," someone shouted from the crowd. "We got it all on video." The tension in the air was palpable, the scene on the verge of exploding. But before it could, the new officer turned to Snoop, his voice calm but firm. "You all right, man?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I'm good," he said, his voice steady. But he's not. The sharp squeal of brakes filled the air as another squad car rolled onto the scene. Its tires screeched against the pavement, drawing the crowd's attention. The car door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. Captain Bryant had arrived. The crowd murmured in recognition, and whispers spread quickly. "That's Captain Bryant. He doesn't mess around." Bryant's polished silver badge gleamed in the sunlight, but it was his commanding presence that silenced the noise. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes scanning the scene like a predator assessing its territory. His dark brown skin contrasted sharply with his crisp uniform, giving him an air of unshakable authority. He stopped a few feet away from the chaos, taking in the sight before him. Snoop Dogg on the ground, handcuffed, with the first officer standing over him. The crowd was buzzing, their phones raised high, capturing every second. Bryant's sharp eyes flicked to the bystanders, then to the first officer, Officer Miller, who looked visibly uneasy. "What in the hell is going on here?" Bryant's voice boomed, cutting through the noise like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, a tone that demanded answers. Miller snapped his head up, his attempt at a confident stance faltering. "Everything's under control, Captain," he said quickly. "Just handling a non-compliant suspect." Bryant's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He looked down at Snoop, then back at Miller. "Non-compliant?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Explain to me why you have Snoop Dogg cuffed and on the ground in front of all these people. Miller shifted on his feet, his gaze darting to the crowd and then back to Bryant. He refused to exit the vehicle when ordered, Miller said, his voice slightly defensive. He resisted commands. Had to restrain him. Bryant's sharp gaze lingered on Miller for a long moment, as if dissecting every word. Then he turned his head slightly toward the crowd. Did anyone here see him resist? He asked, his tone calm but cutting. No! Someone shouted immediately. He did everything they told him to. Another voice called out. We got it all on video, Captain, someone else added. Snoop's been calm the whole time. Bryant raised a hand, signaling the crowd to settle. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes boring into Miller. You hear that? He said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They've got it all on camera. So let me ask you again, Officer Miller. Did he resist, or did you just need to feel important today? Miller's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a brief moment, he glanced over his shoulder at the other officers who had arrived, as if seeking backup. But none of them stepped forward. They stood silently, their eyes focused straight ahead, unwilling to get involved. Bryant took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Answer me, officer, he said sharply, or are you going to keep hiding behind that badge? Miller's eyes flicked back to Snoop, who was still lying on the ground, his face calm, but his gaze sharp. The weight of the crowd's stares and Bryant's authority bore down on him. Finally, he muttered, I was following protocol. Bryant's expression darkened. Protocol? He repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You call this protocol? Pressing a man into the ground for no reason? Cuffing someone who didn't resist? Miller opened his mouth to speak, but Bryant cut him off with a raised hand. Enough, he said, his voice cold. Uncuff him. Now. Miller hesitated, his face flushing with humiliation. He glanced at the cameras, then at the crowd, his pride clearly warring with his orders. Captain, I don't think that's... I didn't ask for your opinion, Officer Miller, Bryant snapped. I gave you an order. Uncuff him. Now. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on Miller as he reached for the keys on his belt. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the cuffs, the metallic click echoing louder than the noise of the crowd. Snoop rolled his shoulders as the cuffs fell away, his movements deliberate. He stood slowly, rubbing his wrists and fixing his gaze on Miller. Bet that didn't feel good, huh? He muttered, his voice low but laced with sharp defiance. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. That's right. Justice, baby. Uncuff the man. Miller's face turned crimson as he stepped back, his hands twitching at his sides. He looked to Bryant, his voice tight with frustration. Captain, I was just... Shut up, Bryant said sharply, stepping in close. His voice was low now, but no less commanding. You've embarrassed this department in front of the entire city, in front of the world. And trust me, this isn't staying local. This is going national. Miller's eyes widened, his confidence evaporating. He opened his mouth again, but Bryant didn't let him speak. Give me your badge, he said, holding out his hand. Right now. Miller's jaw clenched, his expression a mix of anger and fear. Captain, you can't... The badge, Bryant said again, his voice like steel. Hand it over. The moment dragged on for what felt like an eternity. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording. Miller's hand moved slowly to his chest, unpinning the badge. His fingers lingered on it for a second too long before he placed it in Bryant's outstretched hand. Bryant didn't even look at it. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. Now get in your car, he said. Drive back to the station. Go straight to Internal Affairs and tell them Captain Bryant sent you. And trust me, Officer Miller, you're not walking out of this unscathed. Miller's face flushed even deeper. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his cruiser, his steps heavy and defeated. The crowd exploded into cheers, their voices filling the street like a victory rally. You're done, man. Go home, Miller. We see you, Captain. Thank you. Bryant turned back to Snoop, his expression softening slightly. You all right? He asked, his tone quieter now, almost fatherly. Snoop nodded, still rubbing his wrists. I'm good now, Cap, he said. Appreciate you stepping in. Bryant nodded once. Had to, he said simply. If I didn't, this would have gone bad. Real bad. He glanced toward the crowd, his sharp eyes scanning their faces. All right, folk, he said, his voice carrying over the noise. Show's over. Head on home. The crowd began to disperse, but not without a few final cheers and chants. No justice, no peace, someone shouted, and the chant picked up for a moment before fading into the city noise. Bryant watched them go, then turned back to Snoop. You know this isn't over, he said, his voice serious. Internal Affairs is going to come after you, too. They'll try to flip this, say you escalated the situation. Snoop smirked faintly. Let them try, he said. I've got the whole world watching now. Bryant gave him a long look, then nodded. Make sure you stay smart, he said. They love to see us slip. I don't slip, Snoop said firmly. I stand. Bryant nodded again, his expression unreadable. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Snoop standing next to his Ferrari. The street buzzed with lingering energy, but for now the fight was over. The street was quieter now, but the energy lingered in the air like static electricity. Snoop Dogg stood by his Ferrari, his wrists still stinging from the cuffs. The crowd had thinned, but the phones were still raised, their cameras locked on him like he was the star of a blockbuster finale. Snoop turned, leaning casually against the hood of his car. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. He raised one hand slightly, motioning for silence. The crowd immediately quieted, their anticipation palpable. You all saw it, he began, his voice steady but commanding. Every single second of it. They tell us to stay quiet, to cooperate, to follow every rule. And we do. But look what happens. They still push us down. They still try to strip us of our dignity. A wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. Voices shouted back. That's right. We're with you, Snoop. He nodded, his voice growing stronger. This ain't about me, he said. This is about all of us. Every one of us who's been stopped, harassed, or treated like we're less than human. Every one of us who's had to swallow our pride just to make it home safe. The crowd erupted again, their voices mixing with the honks of passing cars. Drivers leaned out of their windows, raising fists in solidarity. Snoop pushed off the car, taking a step closer to the gathered group. His movements were deliberate, his posture commanding. He pointed toward the space where the officer's cruiser had been. Y'all saw how fast it flipped for him, didn't you? 1 minute, he's flexing his badge, thinking he's untouchable. The next, he's handing it over. You know why? The crowd leaned in, hanging on his every word. Because power don't belong to a badge, Snoop said, his voice rising. It belongs to the people, to you, to me, to every single one of us who decides to stand up and say, not today. A cheer erupted, loud and fierce, like a wave crashing against the shore. Snoop let it ride for a moment before raising his hand again to quiet them. They want us to stay scared, he continued, his tone shifting to one of quiet intensity. They want us to believe that we're powerless. But we ain't. We've got the truth on our side. We've got these cameras, these phones. They can't hide from that. The phones in the crowd were raised higher, their screens glowing like a sea of tiny spotlights. Keep recording, Snoop said, looking directly at one of the cameras. Keep sharing. Keep showing the world what's really happening out here, because they're not ready for us. Not anymore. The energy in the air shifted, turning from anger to determination. The crowd seemed to swell with a newfound sense of purpose, their faces lit with hope and resolve. A voice from the back called out, Snoop, what are you going to do next? Snoop turned toward the voice, a small smirk playing on his lips. Next, he said, tilting his head slightly. Next, I'm taking this to court. I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for everyone who's been in my shoes. Another round of cheers erupted, louder than before. Someone shouted, We got your back, Snoop. And the chant picked up, echoing through the street. He raised his hand again, motioning for quiet. But I can't do it alone, he said, his tone serious now. I need y'all. Every one of you. Keep sharing this story. Keep holding them accountable. And don't stop until we see real change. The crowd roared in agreement, their chants growing louder. No justice, no peace, they shouted in unison. the rhythm steady and powerful. Snoop stood still, letting the moment wash over him. He turned toward his phone, which was still live streaming from the dashboard of his Ferrari. Stepping closer, he leaned down slightly, his face filling the frame. His voice softened, but his words carried weight. "Y'all thought this was just a traffic stop," he said. "But it's bigger than that. This is about respect, about dignity, about making sure they know we're not going to take this anymore." The comments on the live stream exploded, hearts and fire emojis flooding the screen. Messages like, "We're with you, Snoop," and "Justice for all" scrolled by so fast they were almost unreadable. He straightened up, looking out at the crowd again. "This ain't the end," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "This is just the beginning." The crowd erupted once more, their cheers echoing down the street. Snoop took a step back, his posture relaxed but his expression resolute. He raised both hands, signaling one final time for silence. "Y'all know what to do," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Keep recording, keep sharing, and don't stop until they feel what we feel." He turned back toward his car, pausing with his hand on the door handle. Glancing over his shoulder, he added one final thought. "And remember, power belongs to the people." With that, he slid into the driver's seat, the low growl of the Ferrari's engine breaking through the noise. The crowd cheered as he pulled away, their voices fading into the distance as he disappeared down the street. The movement had begun, and there was no turning back. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city as Snoop Dogg's Ferrari glided through the streets. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, but his mind was still racing. The echoes of the crowd's cheers and the officers' sneering words played on a loop in his head. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time Snoop reached the gates of his mansion, the notifications on his phone were out of control. Texts, calls, emails, everything was lighting up. The hashtags number Justice for Snoop and number badge 2276 were trending worldwide. Social media was ablaze, the incident already turning into a firestorm. The iron gate slid open as he pulled into his driveway. The familiar sight of towering palm trees lining the path offered some comfort, but Snoop knew he couldn't relax just yet. He parked the Ferrari in his garage, the sound of the engine shutting off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. He grabbed his phone from the cup holder, scrolling through the endless stream of notifications. Headlines were already popping up. "Snoop Dogg detained in shocking traffic stop," and "Viral video sparks outrage against police conduct." A call came through, breaking his focus. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Carla W. He answered, his tone calm but expectant. "Yeah, Carla, I know you got something for me." Her voice came fast and sharp, filled with urgency. "Snoop, it's everywhere. CNN, MSNB, TMZ, they're all running the footage. And it's not just them. Activists are calling, civil rights groups want statements, and the mayor's office just reached out. They're scrambling." Snoop leaned back against the car, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Good. They should be scrambling. What else?" Carla hesitated for a moment. "IA's already involved. The officer's been put on administrative leave, but you know they're going to try to spin this. They'll say you escalated, that you were aggressive." Snoop chuckled softly, shaking his head. "They can try, but the people saw what happened, Carla. It's all there, live and unedited." She sighed, her tone softening slightly. "Just be ready, Snoop. This is going to get bigger, and they're not going to hold back." "I'm always ready," he replied, his voice steady. "Let me know when you've got updates." They ended the call, and Snoop made his way inside the house. The familiar sound of his dog's happy bark greeted him, a small reminder of normalcy in the midst of chaos. But even as he poured himself a glass of water, his mind stayed on the fight ahead. His phone buzzed again, a message from Derek Washington, the journalist. The text was short but explosive. "Body cam footage leaked. Check your email." Snoop's eyebrows shot up as he quickly opened his email. Sure enough, there was a video file waiting for him. He pressed play, and the screen filled with shaky footage from the officer's perspective. The audio crackled as Miller's voice came through loud and clear. "These guys think they own the streets just 'cause they've got money. Gotta remind them who's really in charge." Snoop's jaw tightened as the footage continued, showing every moment of aggression, every insult, and the unnecessary force used. The damning line came near the end. "You ain't special, boy." He paused the video, his eyes narrowing. That single word, boy, hung heavy in the air, more powerful than the footage itself. He didn't hesitate. He uploaded the clip directly to his social media with a simple caption. "Here's your protect and serve. Come your fire Miller. Shock show justice for Snoop." The response was immediate. Within minutes, the post was being shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in. "This is disgusting. How is this guy even a cop? We're with you, Snoop." As the video spread, the media frenzy intensified. News anchors dissected the footage, their voices laced with outrage and disbelief. "It's clear from this video that Officer Miller escalated the situation unnecessarily," one anchor said. Another added, "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Snoop leaned back on his couch, watching the coverage unfold. He wasn't smiling now. This wasn't about gloating. It was about accountability, about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. Another buzz on his phone pulled his attention. It was Carla again, her voice almost breathless. "Snoop, you just broke the internet. Media outlets are begging for interviews. The precinct's been flooded with calls, and IA just requested an official complaint from you." Snoop exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Good," he said. "Tell them I'm filing in person." Carla paused, then laughed softly. "You're really about to show up, huh?" "Damn right I am," he replied. "They need to see that we're not backing down." They ended the call, and Snoop stared at his phone for a moment. The notifications kept coming, each one a reminder of the movement he'd sparked. He opened Instagram Live again, his face filling the screen as thousands of viewers joined within seconds. "Y'all thought this was just about me," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "But this ain't just my fight. This is about all of us, about making sure they can't keep doing this and getting away with it." The comments poured in, filled with fire emojis, raised fists, and messages of solidarity. Snoop nodded slightly, his voice growing stronger. "They think they're untouchable, but we're proving them wrong, one step at a time." He ended the live stream and set his phone aside. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, replaced by a focused determination. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about changing the narrative. As the night wore on, the headlines continued to roll in. Civil rights lawyers offered their support, activists planned marches, and the hashtags number Justice for Snoop and number Fire Miller refused to leave the top trends. The system was shaking, and Snoop was at the center of it all. He stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. His reflection stared back at him, a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. This was bigger than him, bigger than his name. It was a fight for justice, and he wasn't about to let it go. The sun rose the next morning, casting golden rays over the city. Snoop Dogg sat in his kitchen, the faint hum of news anchors' voices filling the air from the TV mounted on the wall. A steaming cup of coffee rested in his hands, the warmth grounding him as he prepared for the day ahead. The events of the previous day were already being labeled a turning point, but Snoop knew the fight was far from over. He glanced at the screen, where the headline read, "Officer suspended after viral traffic stop involving Snoop Dogg." The footage from his live stream played on a loop, showing every key moment: the confrontation, the crowd's outrage, and Captain Bryant demanding Officer Miller's badge. The news anchors discussed the case with a mix of concern and anticipation. "This isn't just about one officer," one anchor said, shaking his head. "This is about accountability within the system." "Absolutely," another agreed. "This viral video has reignited calls for police reform nationwide." Snoop sipped his coffee, letting their words wash over him. He wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a victory yet. It was just the start. His phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with yet another notification. This time it was a text from Derek Washington. "The body cam footage is everywhere now. Miller's career is done. But this fight's bigger than him." Snoop smirked faintly, setting down his mug. He'd been in the spotlight long enough to know that public attention was a double-edged sword. If they weren't careful, the narrative could shift, and the momentum could fade. That wasn't an option. Carla called next, her voice brimming with energy. Snoop, it's all over the news. They're calling for a full investigation into Miller and the entire precinct. Activists are organizing protests, and lawyers are lining up to represent you. Good, Snoop replied simply, leaning back in his chair. Let's keep it moving. What's next? Carla hesitated for a moment before answering. The mayor's office wants a meeting. They're hoping to ease the situation, but we both know what that means. Snoop chuckled softly. They're scared, Carla, and they should be. But this ain't about a meeting. This is about making sure this doesn't happen again. You ready for that kind of pressure? Carla asked, her tone serious now. Because they're going to come at you from all sides. I've been ready, he said firmly. Let's get to work. After ending the call, Snoop stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibilities. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility. Later that day, Snoop arrived at the precinct. Cameras and reporters swarmed the entrance, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. He stepped out of his car, dressed in a sharp black suit that exuded confidence and authority. The crowd erupted as soon as they saw him, their chants filling the air. No justice, no peace. Snoop, Snoop, Snoop. He raised a hand, acknowledging their support before heading inside. The atmosphere shifted immediately, the cold, sterile walls of the precinct, a stark contrast to the energy outside. Captain Bryant was waiting for him, his expression calm but serious. Snoop, Bryant said, extending a hand. Glad you came. Had to, Snoop replied, shaking his hand firmly. We've got work to do. Bryant nodded, leading him down the hallway to a conference room where a team of lawyers and officials awaited. The conversation was tense, but Snoop held his ground. He spoke clearly, laying out his expectations for accountability, transparency, and systemic change. He wasn't interested in half measures or empty promises. By the time the meeting ended, the mood in the room had shifted. The officials knew they weren't dealing with just another celebrity. They were dealing with someone determined to make a difference. As Snoop stepped back outside, the crowd erupted once more. He walked to the podium that had been set up for him, the microphones amplifying his voice for everyone to hear. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady but passionate. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who's ever been treated unfairly, who's ever been silenced, who's ever felt powerless. The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers filling the street. We're not stopping here, Snoop continued, his tone rising. This is just the beginning. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to demand change, and we're not going to back down. The chants grew louder. No justice, no peace. Snoop raised his hand, motioning for silence. Y'all know what to do, he said, his voice strong and commanding. Keep sharing the truth. Keep fighting for what's right. And don't stop until we see real justice. The crowd erupted one final time, their voices a chorus of hope and determination. Snoop stepped back, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. This was about a movement, and it was just getting started. As he drove home later that evening, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. The weight of the day settled on him, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt purposeful. His phone buzzed again as he pulled into his driveway. This time it was a text from Carla. You did good today. They're listening now. Snoop smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting a quiet determination. He knew this fight wasn't over, but for the first time it felt like they were finally being heard. Snoop leaned back in his chair later that night, scrolling through the endless stream of messages on his phone. The hashtags were still trending, and the support from around the world was overwhelming. But he wasn't celebrating. This wasn't about him. This was about a system that needed to change. He opened Instagram Live one last time, his face filling the screen as thousands of viewers joined instantly. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice calm but powerful. This is about all of us, and we're just getting started. Stay loud, stay strong, and don't stop fighting. The screen filled with hearts and fire emojis, the comments scrolling too fast to read. Snoop ended the live stream, setting his phone down with a sense of quiet resolve. Outside, the city hummed with life, but the world felt different. A spark had been lit, and Snoop knew it would only grow stronger. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement, and he wasn't about to let it fade.